Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The atmospheric scanner had been wrong before. Gerald, which was what Dale Rourke called the handheld unit, because naming something after the most unreliable person he had ever known felt like an appropriate tribute to its performance record, had once classified a Vetheran marsh crawler as probable agricultural machinery, and on another occasion had spent 40 minutes insisting that a perfectly healthy silverback tree was emitting life signs consistent with medium-confidence vertebrate. So when Gerald began registering a combustion signature at 3:40 hours on a Tuesday morning, Dale's first instinct was not alarm. It was the specific, weary skepticism of a man who has been disappointed by the same piece of equipment so many times that disappointment has become a kind of intimacy. He checked the reading twice. He shook Gerald in the way that the manufacturer's guide specifically advised against, which had become the first step in his personal diagnostic protocol. The signature held. Small, steady, northeast of his current position by approximately 2 kilometers, sitting in the middle of the Vetheran greenbelt like something that had decided the rules did not apply to it. Dale pulled on his jacket, sealed his boots, the left one sighing in the particular way it had developed since its third resoling, a sound less like a boot and more like an editorial, and stepped out of the monitoring station into the Vetheran night. The forest at this hour was the kind of dark that colonists never quite made peace with. On standard worlds, darkness was a matter of light source and distance. On Vethara 9, darkness was a collaboration. The native silverbarks grew in interlocking canopy formations so dense that the moon, a modest, unhelpful satellite that the original survey team had optimistically named Lumen, contributed approximately the same illumination as a single lamp viewed from the far end of a very long corridor. What light reached the forest floor came filtered and fractured, silver-thin, catching the resin sheaths of the lower branches and making them gleam like old glass. It was beautiful, the way things are beautiful when they are also trying to quietly kill you. Vethara 9 had been classified as a Tier 1 protected biosphere 17 years ago, which meant that Dale's entire professional existence was organized around the chemical temperament of its plant life. The silverbarks and their cousin species stored volatile oxidation compounds in their cellular walls, compounds that, when exposed to uncontrolled heat, initiated a thermochemical cascade capable of consuming 3 kilometers of canopy in under an hour. The Coalition Environmental Authority had named this process with the enthusiasm of academics who enjoyed naming things. The Vetheran amplification cycle. The settlers who had lost the Crossfield Township agricultural quarter in the first year of colonial expansion had named it something shorter and more expressive, the kind of language that does not appear in scientific literature, but that everyone in the field understood perfectly. This was why fire on Vethara 9 was not merely prohibited. It was the sort of prohibition written into founding charters, stenciled onto the walls of intake processing centers, explained personally to every new colonist within their first 72 hours of arrival by someone like Dale, whose job it was to be the human face of consequences. He had done this walk before, or walks like it, usually settlers. Once, a malfunctioning irrigation relay that had generated enough heat friction to confuse Gerald into a 3-hour false alarm. The marsh crawler incident, which he had written up in a report that his supervisor had read twice before asking, very carefully, if he was feeling all right. What was different tonight? What he noticed after the first kilometer, when his eyes had adjusted, and he was moving through the silverbarks with the quiet, measured pace the forest required, was the behavior of the signature itself. It was not spreading. It was not pulsing in the irregular rhythm of an accident finding its edges. It was steady and contained and deliberate in the way that only intention produces, and whoever had made this fire had done something that no careless settler would think to do. The burn radius had been cleared. The surrounding root exposure had been managed. The fire was small, and it was staying small, and Dale slowed his pace because the forest ahead of him was beginning to glow orange through the trees, and Gerald, with the timing of the genuinely useless, chose this precise moment to update its reading to high-confidence large shrub. He was almost at the clearing when he checked Gerald one final time, decided to forgive it on the grounds that none of this was going to be simple anyway, and stepped through the last line of silverbarks into the firelight. She was sitting cross-legged beside the fire with the particular stillness of someone who had decided, at some point before his arrival, that the world was going to do whatever it was going to do, and the appropriate response was to let it. Dale Rourke stood at the edge of the clearing for 2 full seconds, which was long enough for him to register her, recognize her, and experience the specific variety of cognitive malfunction that occurs when reality declines to match its advanced billing. Before his body remembered that it had been walking for 2 hours, and his legs made the independent decision to stop. She was Solvari. He could see that immediately, the way you see certain things immediately, not because they are obvious, but because your brain files them before your attention arrives. The Solvari were humanoid in the way that a translation is humanoid. The essential structure intact, the details somewhere between familiar and quietly wrong. She was tall even seated, with the elongated proportional build common to her people, and across her cheekbones and down the line of her throat, bioluminescent markings pulsed in slow amber rhythms, the color of firelight seen through old resin, involuntary and continuous in the way of things the body does when the mind is occupied elsewhere. Her eyes, when she raised them, were copper gold with vertical pupils, and they caught the fire the way still water catches the sky. She had 4 fingers on each hand rather than 5. Her ears swept back at an angle that was less dramatic than human imagination typically produced when the word alien was involved, and more quietly arresting than comfort prepared you for. She was wearing civilian clothes, a plain thermal jacket in dark green, trousers that communicated function without interest, nothing that corresponded in any way to the decorated uniform that her rank demanded, or to the images that had been transmitted across the coalition network 18 months ago when the Cerise convergence ended, and the civilization she had protected began the process of deciding how to thank her for it. Dale knew her face. This was the part that his brain was still working through, slowly, like Gerald attempting to process a reading that contradicted its base assumptions. He knew her face the way you know the faces of people who exist at sufficient altitude that their images become part of the general atmosphere of an era. People you have never met but whose presence in the world has shaped the texture of the last several years of your life, without anyone asking your permission. General Sareth Vale Khan, the architect of the Cascade Doctrine, the officer whose tactical decisions over 3 years of a war that everyone with access to the casualty projections had privately concluded was unwinnable, had ended that war in 17 days. Her name appeared in history texts beside phrases that the writers of history texts reserved for events they needed future generations to understand were important. She was supposed to be on Varanthos Prime. There had been a ceremony scheduled. A medal, the unified star, which Dale had once seen at a museum exhibition, and which was approximately the size of a dinner plate and looked like something designed by a committee that had been told to convey significance without being given further guidance. She had disappeared 6 months ago under circumstances that Coalition Command described, when asked directly, in the tone of voice that institutions use when the truth is available but inconvenient. She looked at him the way a tide looks at a shore, not with alarm, not with calculation, with the steady, exhausted acknowledgement of something that has known for a while that a particular moment was coming and has run out of the energy to resent its arrival. She said hello in careful, accented coalition standard. Then she said nothing else and waited, and the fire burned between them with the composure of something that was being very well managed. Dale opened his mouth. He had, in the 2 kilometers of dark forest between the monitoring station and this clearing, assembled a speech about fire safety regulations on protected biospheres. It was a good speech. He had given versions of it many times. It covered the Vetharan amplification cycle, the specific legal provisions of the colonial charter, and the fines associated with unauthorized combustion events. And he had developed over the years a delivery that was firm without being aggressive, informative without being condescending. He closed his mouth. He looked at General Sareth Vale Khan, the officer who had ended a war and saved 4 billion lives, and was now sitting in an illegal clearing on a protected wilderness world, wearing a thermal jacket that had seen better decades. He opened his mouth again. "You're 600 light-years from where you're supposed to be," he said. She looked back at the fire. "Yes," she said, "I'm aware." The forest filled the silence that followed with the sounds it always made at this hour. The slow respiratory creak of silverbarks in the dark, something moving through the mid-canopy that Gerald, had Dale thought to check, would almost certainly have classified as a weather phenomenon. Dale looked at the fire, which was burning with a discipline that he found, now that his initial processing was catching up with his observations, genuinely remarkable. The cleared radius, the treated root exposure, the precise, architectural containment of something that on this world was never supposed to be small. He sat down. His legs had made this decision before he had, and he had long since learned to trust them on questions of this nature. The fire was warm. The general did not look like someone who was leaving. Gerald, in his jacket pocket, updated its reading on the figure across the fire to high-confidence large shrub. And Dale decided that proximity to accurate data was, professionally speaking, the responsible choice. For a while neither of them spoke, and the fire did what fires do when no one is asking anything of them. It burned quietly, consuming the measured fuel she had laid beside it, and the silverbarks held the dark at the edges of the clearing. And Vethara 9 continued its slow indifference to the fact that 2 people were sitting in the middle of its protected wilderness at 4 in the morning not saying anything. Dale had spent a significant portion of his career in silences. Search and rescue produced them reliably. The silence of waiting for a signal, the silence of a collapsed structure before it tells you where the person inside it is, the silence of someone who has been frightened badly enough that language has temporarily left the building. He had learned to read silences the way Gerald was theoretically designed to read atmospheric data, which meant imperfectly but with genuine effort. This one had weight to it. Not the weight of hostility, not the weight of someone deciding whether to run. It was the weight of a person who had been carrying something for long enough that setting it down, even briefly, even in the presence of a stranger, required more deliberation than the act itself warranted. He did not push it. He checked Gerald instead, which told him that the ambient temperature had dropped 2 degrees since his arrival, and that the figure across the fire remained, per its confident assessment, a large shrub. He put Gerald away. She spoke first. She did it the way she had looked at him, without preamble, without the warming up that humans typically required before they arrived at the sentence they actually meant to say. She said she had needed to see something burn that she could control. She said it plainly, in the flat, undecorated standard of someone translating not just across languages, but across the larger distance between what a thing is and what words can do with it. She said she had needed flames that consumed only what she fed them. Dale did not say anything. She continued. The Cerise convergence, in the history texts he had read, and he had read them. The way people read accounts of events that have rearranged the world they live in, with the mixture of duty and unease that important documents tend to produce, was described as the decisive action that ended a 3-year war of expanding catastrophe. The Cascade Doctrine, 17 days. 3 Dravathi population centers rendered uninhabitable through coordinated atmospheric disruption and orbital bombardment sequencing that coalition military analysts still argued about in papers full of words like unprecedented and synthesis. and in one case, terrifying elegance. The war had ended. 4 billion lives in 17 inhabited systems had been preserved. The history texts were very thorough about the 4 billion. She was not talking about the 4 billion. She was talking about the other number. The one that lived in subordinate clauses and passive constructions, in the grammatical architecture that civilizations develop specifically for facts they need recorded but not examined. The population evacuation projections had been modeled against 3 operational timelines. She had chosen the timeline that preserved the tactical window. She had known, at the moment of that choice, what the difference between timelines contained, had run the numbers herself, at 200 hours in a command center on a carrier called the Ardent Promise, which was a name she had thought at the time was aggressively optimistic for a ship involved in the business it was involved in. She had chosen anyway, because her modeling showed that the alternative was the subordinate clause expanding across 17 systems rather than 3 population centers, and the math had been correct, and she had been right, and she could not stop being right about it, and she could not stop seeing those fires when she closed her eyes. She said all of this with the steadiness of someone who had said it before in the dark, to no one, many times. Her bioluminescent markings held their slow amber pulse throughout. The Sylvari autonomic system, Dale knew from basic coalition xenobiology, did not suppress its signals the way human faces learned to. Whatever she was feeling moved through her skin in light whether she chose it or not. He found, watching her across the controlled fire, that he was grateful for this, in the way you are grateful for things that tell you the truth without requiring translation. He did not tell her she had no choice. He had heard enough to understand that she possessed, in precise and undiminished detail, every argument available for her own defense, and that she had assembled them correctly, and that their correctness was exactly the thing she could not rest in. The architecture of justification, however sound, was not the same as a place to sleep. What he said, after the silence had gone on long enough that something in the mid-canopy had completed what appeared to be a full vocal performance of considerable ambition, was, "Gerald thinks you're a large shrub." She looked at him. The amber light across her cheekbones pulsed once, sharply, in the way of a system receiving unexpected input. "Gerald," she said. He explained Gerald. This took longer than a reasonable person would expect, because Gerald's failures were both numerous and thematically varied, and once Dale began accounting for them, he found that each one led naturally to the next in the way of any story that is fundamentally about the gap between a thing's design and its performance. The marshcrawler incident, the 17-minute argument Gerald had initiated with a rock formation, the time Gerald had classified Dale himself, during a calibration test, as possible atmospheric event, low confidence. By the time he reached the incident with the irrigation relay, which Gerald had first identified as a person, then as a weather system, then as a person again, settling finally on the verdict uncertain, awaiting further data, which Dale had found philosophically interesting given the circumstances, something in her expression had shifted. Not much. The kind of shift that a person makes when something small and unexpected finds a gap in the thing they have been holding tightly. The fire burned between them, small and accountable, and the silverbarks held their light, and Gerald sat in his pocket being quietly, consistently wrong about everything, and Dale decided that this was, for the moment, enough. Dawn on Vethara 9 did not arrive so much as it accumulated. The light came from the east in long, gradual increments, working its way down through the canopy the way a careful argument works its way toward its conclusion, not rushing, making its case layer by layer, until the silverbarks went from black to silver to the pale, resinous gold they held in full daylight, when the whole forest looked briefly like something that had been designed rather than evolved. Dale had watched this particular transformation many times from many positions in the Greenbelt, and he had never entirely made peace with how beautiful it was, which he considered a professional hazard, since the forest's beauty and the forest's capacity to incinerate everything within it existed in such easy coexistence that admiring one required a constant low-level awareness of the other. He had not slept. Sarith had not slept. The fire had burned itself down through the night to a bed of coals that she managed with the focused, peripheral attention of someone for whom the monitoring of combustion had long since become something the body did without consulting the mind. She adjusted it periodically with a stick she had selected hours ago for reasons she had not explained, and that Dale had not asked about, because by this point in the night he had developed a reliable instinct for the questions that were welcome and the questions that were not, and structural assessments of firewood fell, he felt, into a category that was better left to her expertise. Gerald, who had spent the night in Dale's jacket pocket, accruing what the manufacturer's documentation called passive environmental data, and what Dale called being wrong continuously at low power consumption, had updated its assessment of Sarith twice since midnight. She was no longer a large shrub. She was, per Gerald's current reading, a probable geological formation, medium confidence, which Dale felt was in some ways a lateral move, but in other ways represented genuine creative development on Gerald's part. He had considered telling her about the update and decided it was better deployed strategically, for a moment when it would do more work. The question of what came next had been present in the space between them since approximately the second hour of conversation, in the way that certain questions are present, acknowledged by neither party, handled by mutual agreement through the slower process of letting the night use itself up until the question answered itself, or the light arrived and made avoidance harder. The Coalition Military Intelligence Division, she had told him at some point in the small hours, had been looking for her. Not aggressively. The disappearance of a decorated general 3 months before a public honors ceremony required a particular quality of careful management, the kind of looking that needed to be thorough enough to be real and restrained enough not to become a story. There were people who needed her to stand on a stage. History, she said, without bitterness but without softness either, was not comfortable with endings it could not frame and present and point to. She was going back. She told him this in the flat, clear tone of a decision that had been made before the conversation that contained it. The kind of decision that does not require the moment of its announcement because it was never actually in question. Not for the ceremony, not for the medal, which she described in terms that suggested she had strong architectural opinions about the unified star's design, none of them favorable. She was going back because there were officers who had executed the Cascade Doctrine inside the operational parameters she had designed, junior commanders who had followed orders she had given, and she was not willing to let her disappearance become the fixed point around which the record organized its accounting. If history was going to look for someone to hold, it was going to find her standing in the light, not absent from it. She would not let her vanishing become the reason someone else's name ended up in the wrong kind of sentence. Dale sat with this for a while. Outside, the silverbarks continued their slow, golden transformation, and something in the upper canopy made the sound it made every morning at this hour, which Gerald had classified overnight as wind event, low confidence, and which Dale was fairly certain was a living creature of some kind, though he had never seen it directly. He thought about what she had said, and he thought about what it cost to say it the way she had said it, not like sacrifice, not like nobility, but like logistics. The most operational person he had ever met, applying operational thinking to the problem of her own return. He told her he would need to file a supplementary incident report. This was true. CSD protocol required it. Any fire event investigation that involved contact with a third party required a follow-up documentation within 72 hours of initial contact, including identifying information for any individuals present at the scene. He was professionally obligated. He was also, he explained, currently carrying a backlog of 14 anomalous readings that Gerald had flagged over the past week, each of which technically required ground verification before he could close them. And given that Gerald had identified most of them as combinations of large vegetation and weather phenomena that might or might not also be geological formations, the verification process was going to require careful attention. 72 hours, he said, was a conservative estimate. It might be slightly longer, given Gerald's recent performance. She looked at him across the cooling coals in the first real light of the Vetheran morning. Her bioluminescent markings had shifted overnight from the amber pulse of deep thought to something slower and quieter, a color closer to pale rose gold that moved through her skin with the easy rhythm of a system that had, temporarily, put down a weight it had been carrying for 6 months. He had learned enough about Sylvari autonomic language over the course of the night to understand that this was not nothing. She said that 72 hours was sufficient time to remember what silence sounded like. She said it the way someone says a thing they mean precisely, without the human instinct to soften precision with approximation. Dale told her that Gerald had reclassified her as a geological formation at some point around 300, and that he personally found this to be Gerald's most defensible assessment yet, given that she had barely moved in 6 hours and had demonstrated more structural stability than most of the actual rock formations he had surveyed in his career on Vethara 9. She made a sound. It was not